Yes, I'd like to thank Izmir Katip Çelebi University for the invitation. And for me, it's always a joy to speak about Orientalism and Edward Said's contribution to post-colonialism. And I think Edward Said's contribution to post-colonial thinking was not just academic. It was also, in a very definitive sense, political, in that he managed to combine a critical study of Orientalist discourses with a overt political strategy. We could call that resistance, if you will. Can you see my PowerPoint slides? Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can see them very well.
Okay. Oh, great. Thank you. Yes. So for those who are not that familiar with Edward Said, he was a Palestinian American academic, and he taught English and comparative literature at Columbia University. However, he spent his early life between Palestine and Egypt, and was educated at Victoria School or College in Cairo. And Said, in his late teens, found his way to the USA and subsequently studied there. And he emerged as a leading academic in the field of comparative literature. In the 1970s, we see a shift in Edward Said's focus or orientation with regard to academia. And he wrote Orientalism in the late 1970s. And this book was the first of a trilogy, which includes The Question of Palestine and Carving Islam. And these three books, they critique Western stereotypes of Islam and Arabs across a variety of genres and fields. And what's very interesting about Edward Said is his ability to draw upon, in a very eclectic fashion, some would say contradictory, maybe I'm using a euphemism, drawing upon Michel Foucault, Antonio Gramsci, and Eric Urbach, and importantly, I would say, Giambattista Vico. And we see that Said's scholarship combined an interest in both power and knowledge, and he deployed concepts such as discourse and hegemony. Again, some would say, well, these are widely contradictory concepts, but I would say the contradictions allowed a certain creative tension in his writings. And I think it will be useful for us to situate Edward Said's writings in a political context, and that is the twilight of the age of empires after World War II. And the British and the French gave up most of their colonies in the Arab world by the early 1970s. And instead, we see the USA filling the vacuum and succeeding these former metropole colonial powers. And in 1948, we see the creation of the State of Israel and the expulsion of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, which is something I will address towards the end of today's lecture. And well, so Edward Said's Orientalism sparked a debate. However, it was by no means the first book or intervention to broach the topic about the relationship between academia and imperialism. And Said argued that Orientalist knowledge is not disinterested. It doesn't write about politics. And actually, it has created and exercises authority over an Orient. And critics ranging from Ajas Ahmed to Bernard Lewis questioned both Edward Said and Orientalism. And the Marxist critique of Said's Orientalism revolves around Said's, what some would say, his post-structuralist loyalties. as opposed to being committed to to a revolutionary agenda as such. So Ajaz Ahmed finds Edward Said's Orientalism not to be that scholarly per se, and rather it betrays a bourgeois affiliation. However, Bernard Lewis's critique of Orientalism relies on an argument that, well, Orientalism is an apolitical discipline, and Said lacked the scholarly credentials to critique Orientalists within a very specialist field. And well, what is Orientalism according to Said? Well, Said argues that Orientalism is primarily, although not exclusively, a British and French cultural enterprise. So it's quite interesting that Said speaks about academic knowledge and a field such as Orientalism using the term culture or cultural. And this particular cultural enterprise denotes a specific geographical field, otherwise known as the Near Orient or the Middle East. And Orientalism is a reservoir of accredited knowledge. And it exercises a cultural hegemony in the Occident-Orient relationship. And this leads to Westerners, whether they be scholars, soldiers, traders, or missionaries, in a flexible positional superiority to the Oriental natives. And Said goes on to say that the semi-mythical Orient is actually created in Orientalism. And Said says in Orientalism, he is not particularly interested in a real Orient as such. Said's objective, or rather mission, if I can use that phrase, in Orientalism is to unveil the inner dynamics that makes Orientalism an authoritative field of study. And Said dates the rise of modern Orientalism around the period of Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798. And this period ushered in an Oriental Renaissance. And for Said, Napoleon's invasion of Egypt provided the very model of the scientific appropriation of one culture by a stronger culture. And Said notes that up until this invasion, the study of Orientalism wasn't really characterized by very meticulous advanced preparations. However, Napoleon, in the years preceding 1798, recruited two armies. The first made up of soldiers, the second of scholars. And Said notes that Napoleon read the works of Orientalists such as Comte de Volney. And de Volney's books broached the topic of France's colonial ambitions. And de Volney identified three key obstacles to France's colonial ambitions. First, the British, the second, the Ottoman Empire, and the third obstacle, Muslims. And Said says Napoleon creatively adapted de Volney's insights. And we see that when Napoleon invaded Egypt, he invoked the authority of the Ottoman Sultan. And he decried the oppression wrought by the Mamluks on the citizens, or rather the inhabitants of Egypt. So Napoleon's creative use of de Volney witnessed the invoking of Islam and trying to persuade native Egyptians that Napoleon was actually the hero and came to the rescue. And Said observes, or rather argues, that Napoleon's invasion of Egypt also sought to create a laboratory, or rather a theater of effective Western knowledge about the Orient that would first be applied in Egypt and later in Islamic lands. Napoleon brought with him dozens of scholars from various fields, and they recorded and classified the sites that they came across, whether they were of ancient origin or more contemporary. And Said observes that Napoleon's invasion ushered in a more scientific approach, which made greater claims of authority and introduced a certain discipline to Orientalism. And the period following Napoleon's invasion, Said mentions it corresponded to a development of the institutions and content of Orientalism and the unparalleled European expansion between 1815 and 1914. That the European empires expanded the control of the Earth's surface from 35% to 85%. So what's interesting about Said's critique of Orientalism is that he makes a direct connection between the proliferation of the academic study of Orientalism and imperialism. So he draws a straight line between the two. And Said also finds a connection between politics and an imagined geography. As we mentioned before I started presenting, Didam Hoja did. East and West are very positional insofar as the observer, or rather in this case, the Orientalist, constructs the Orient or the East in relation to his or her locality or location. And this imagined geography brought with it a whole series of interests. And also it was complemented by a will or intention to understand, control, manipulate, and incorporate what was perceived to be manifestly different. And Orientalism as a discourse was also complemented by an uneven exchange with political, intellectual, cultural, and moral power. So you have the Orientalists on the one hand, describing, classifying, and analyzing the Oriental, and the Oriental, on the other hand, a passive object of study. And Said's contribution to the critique of Orientalism, as I mentioned, he was by no means the first person or scholar to question the relationship between power and Orientalism in the field of Orientalism. We see this in the writings of Marshall Hodgson, the University of Chicago historian in the 1940s and 50s. Anwar Abdul Malik, an Egyptian Marxist, who similarly critiqued Orientalists and the stereotypical accounts of the Orient. But to come back to Edward Said, he was able to utilize discourse as an analytical category to critique the works of Orientalists. And we can better understand discourse as a means of struggle that can control and constrain what can be written or thought. In other words, Orientalism as a discourse created an orthodoxy of knowledge. And Leela Gandhi describes discourses as heavily policed cognitive systems which control and delimit both the mode and the means of representation in a given society. And Orientalism as a discourse awards the right to speak and represent on behalf of the Orient to the Orientalist, and constructs a primitive and backward other. And by depicting the Orient as backward and a need of the civilizing mission, or mission civilizatrice. This provides the necessity and the desirability of colonial government. So the very denigration of the Orient as a backward space justified imperialism, according to Said. And Said quotes Karl Marx in Orientalism to the fact that they cannot represent themselves; they must be represented. And Karl Marx was actually referring to the French peasantry here, but Said adapts and incorporates this particular insight to refer to the relationship between Orientalists and the so-called Orientals. And back to a concept I mentioned, orthodoxy. Orientalism itself was, or rather is, based upon the premise that, well, it's based upon a set of claims of authority in a system of knowledge that emerged in Europe about the Orient. And Orientalism as a system of knowledge includes different genres and fields, from philology to anthropology, and in more recent decades, one would say area studies. And this orthodoxy of Orientalism posits Europe in a position of strength and domination with the relationship between Occident and Orient. And the West is seen as a strong partner, and the East is seen as a weak partner. And Said, among many politicians and Orientalist scholars, mentions and discusses Arthur Balfour and Lord Cromer. And both of these men illustrated an image of the Orient or the Oriental as irrational, depraved, childlike, and different, as opposed to the Occident or the Occidental being rational, virtuous, mature, and normal. So Said's critique of Orientalism allows us to see a system of knowledge that propagated a binary, East and West, Occident versus Orient, rational versus irrational. And Said notes that Orientalists were concerned with the Orient as a problem. And this problem consisted of, well, how do we get hold of the Orient? How should one approach it? And how should the Orientalist engage with the Orient so not to be defeated or overwhelmed by its sublimity, scope, or awful dimensions? So the main task for the Orientalists, Said would argue, was, well, the Orient itself is this inscrutable mystery that poses a danger, or rather its depravity makes it a challenge to understand. And Said identifies 3 dimensions with regard to the problem of the Orient. The Orientalist addresses the reader. So there is a specific audience to whom the Orientalist is representing the Orient. And at the same time, with regard to the second dimension, the Orientalist seeks to contain the Orient, seeks to control and make it, well, to domesticate it for the reader and for himself. And also the third dimension, which refers to the subtitle of my lecture today, or my presentation, representing the Orient on its behalf. So the Orientalist occupies a position, or rather the responsibility, to not only present or represent the Orient to the reader, but to speak on behalf of the Oriental, because he or she is unable to represent themselves. And this problem of the Orient works in a chain of authorities, and each work affiliates with other works, and with audiences and institutions, and importantly, the Orient, the semi-mythical Orient. And Said sketches a critique of Orientalism with regard to its intertextuality. And this is something that Ajas Ahmed, the Marxist whom we encountered earlier, questions Edward Said about, that he was merely reinforcing the philological bias of Orientalists by focusing on the writings of Orientalists. But anyway, back to the problem of the Orient. Well, the Orientalist's main job was to demystify the Orient, so to make it plain to himself and to his audience. And Said, in covering Islam, which is the third part of the trilogy started by Orientalism, he notes that Orientalists were preoccupied with explaining what Islam is. And often this term was used to explain or make blanket condemnations of Islam. And this itself spurred on attacks. And he goes on to say that the more the critiques of Islam occurred, the more fuel to the fire of the hostility between self-appointed Muslim and Western spokespersons. And bear in mind that Said was writing this before Samuel Huntington penned his Clash of Civilizations in the early 90s. So Said was acutely aware that that the anti-Islamic rhetoric, or rather narrative produced by, or rather articulated by Orientalists, actually had a knock-on effect among Muslims and created this defensive posture. And Said says, well, Islam as a label, it disregards that Muslims make up 1 billion people on this planet, and that there are dozens of countries, societies, traditions, and languages. And furthermore, Muslims, they possess an infinitely different variety of experiences. So we see that Said rejects the reductionist label of Islam to first analyze and to take into account the billions of Muslims that exist on this planet. And yes, and he questions the insistence that Islam regulates Islamic societies from top to bottom, that there is a monolithic, singular Dar al-Islam. So Said argued against the narrative that Islam is the default category to understand what Muslims do. And instead, he proposed, well, we ought to look at more secular factors, such as economics, sociology, politics, what have you. And the resort to Islam as a label, for him, for Said, it's an unacceptable generalization of the most irresponsible sort. That by invoking a reductionist label such as Islam, yes, it does a great injustice to Muslims. And Said noticed in his analysis of writings within the USA about Islam that it is more often than not conflated with fundamentalism, despite the fact that fundamentalism as a concept was related to the rise of Protestantism. And Said targets his critique on Bernard Lewis, among other Orientalists, and his analysis of the word watan, or Vatan in Turkish. And Said argues, well, Said's views are merely derivative of 19th century British and French Orientalists, that Islam is a threat to Christianity and liberal values. And Bernard Lewis's scholarship is characterized by the position that Islam exists outside of the known, familiar, and acceptable world we live in. And that, well, Muslims have inherited a European anti-Semitism in their war against modernity. So Said problematizes Bernard Lewis's scholarship that, well, that Muslims appear to be anti-modern, and specifically Arabs, I would argue, and that Islam is something that can be known and mastered by Orientalists such as Lewis. However, Said argues, well, Bernard Lewis's work is characterized by a fraudulent use or mistaken use of etymology, such as Vatan or Watan, that it is stripped of its genuine territorial or affiliative meanings. So when Arabs or Muslims speak about Watan or Vatan, well, they don't actually mean what Europeans mean by nationalism, patriotism, and solidarity, or rather loyalty to particular lands. And Said, Lewis, according to Said, merely cites 2 or 3 examples from medieval Arabic literature, while ignoring more recent examples from the 19th century to the present. So Lewis's work is fixated primarily on the pre-modern Islamic scholarship, rather than looking at the writings of Rafa Tahtawi, Khairuddin al-Tunisi, and even Jamaluddin al-Afghani. By looking at these writers, we see that well, nationalism as a concept was indeed incorporated by Arabs and Muslims from the 18th century onwards, and we can actually look at the works of Ibrahim Abu Lughud, a colleague of Bernard Lewis, but also a close friend of Edward Said. And what was Said's position on objectivity? Well, Said questioned the very notion of objectivity, especially in relation to the field of Orientalism. But that didn't stop him from saying, well, knowledge can be less or more partial, precisely because human beings, we cannot escape our positionality and the pressures of everyday reality. And the label of political, Said argued, well, it is used to discredit those who breach the protocol of pretended supra-political objectivity. And it's interesting to see Said deploying Gramsci, or rather the Gramscian notion of political society, to argue that, well, politics does intrude into civil society, and that the agenda of politicians is actually inserted into the academy and Orientalism as a field of study. So what's important for Orientalists, or rather what's important for politicians, becomes important for Orientalists, to put it simply. And well, is Orientalism merely a justification of colonial power? Well, Said disagrees with this particular characterization. He says, if I may quote Said's Orientalism, to say simply that Orientalism was a rationalization of colonial rule is to ignore the extent to which colonial rule was justified in advance by Orientalism, rather than after the fact. Men have always divided the world into regions having either real or imagined distinction from each other. So Said here is saying, well, look, it would be a mistake to merely say that Orientalism was a post-facto rationalization of military power, and that Orientalism is a body of knowledge with express political implications, and that it is a cultural discourse prior to military might, and that East and West, or Orient and Occident, were imagined and then subsequently influenced the theater of imperialism in more distant lands. And this quote allows us to see that Said indeed did part ways from Marxist or materialist accounts of capitalism and imperialism. Said's preoccupation with Orientalism did not revolve around capitalism as a global phenomenon, but rather colonialism as an ideological edifice or architecture that enabled and facilitated imperialism. And well, what Orientalists exist to Orientalist representations? Again, to reiterate a previous point I made, Said wasn't particularly interested in drawing a picture of the true or real Orient. I mean, the Orient for him was a semi-mythical construct, which was invested with academic authority, political power, and cultural hegemony. However, in culture and imperialism, Said speaks about the rise or eruption of subjugated knowledges, drawing upon a concept of Foucault's. And he discusses the literature and scholarship from the post-colonial world, such as Chinua Achebe and Wally Soyinka. For those of you unfamiliar with these two names, Achebe and Soyinka were, or rather are, Nigerian writers, and they broached the topic of colonialism and identity from a specifically Nigerian perspective. There isn't one, by the way. And Said goes on to argue that well, intellectuals have written in an imperial language, whether it be English or French. And at the same time, they felt organically related to mass resistance to empire. So Said says, well, it is possible to write in the language of the metropole colonial power and critique imperialism. And we see that the techniques, discourses, and weapons of scholarship and criticism of the West are actually adopted to propose a revisionist, critical task of dealing with metropolitan culture. So Said wrote primarily in English, although occasionally in Arabic as well. However, we see that his agenda of decolonization at both the epistemic or intellectual and political levels was largely done in the language of a former colonial metropole, namely in English. And Said in Culture and Imperialism also discusses well, the hierarchical distinction between ruler and ruled that exists in every colonial relationship. And the alternatives to Orientalism should not reinforce this distinction or binary. And he notes that nativism in the former colonized societies has actually reinforced this distinction while evaluating the position of the weaker or subservient power. And although he notes, well, nativism has offered compelling and demagogic assertions about a native past, it still adheres to the colonial logic of Orient and Occident, East and West, Africa and Europe. And he cites examples such as Senghor's negritude, the Rastafarian movement, Marcus Garvey and his movement to go back to Africa, and also the rediscoveries of a pre-colonial, or rather pre-colonial Muslim essences. Said's project of resistance did not hark back to a pre-colonial history, which is very similar to Frantz Fanon's own reflections on the issue, in his critique of colonialism, that there's no going back to a pristine pre-colonial period. That once the colonized have been colonized, decolonization requires moving forward rather than going back. And that by accepting, or rather internalizing this binary, nativism accepts the racial, religious, and political consequences of imperialism, and embarks on self-essentialization, to put it simply. And yes, and Said saw himself as a public intellectual, but also as an amateur critic. And he rejected the professionalization of Orientalism, in that it brought together authority, knowledge, and representation in power, or rather within the project of imperialism. That with the professionalization of the Orientalist, we see that the Oriental is rendered silent and passive. Only the Western Orientalist is qualified to dictate what is the Orient, both to his audience in the West and to Orientalists or to Orientals in the East. And Said revealed the not so disinterested relationship between Orientalists and politicians. And in the run-up to the 2003 Iraq War, very prominent academics such as Fuad Agami, who taught at Johns Hopkins University, Bernard Lewis at Princeton University, they met with the Bush administration and advised them that, that the Iraqis would wholeheartedly embrace an American invasion of Iraq and the end of the Saddam Hussein regime. That particular prediction has met with the brute force, or rather, met with the rude awakening that a civil war ensued, and we saw the rise of ISIS in the country. So both Agami and Lewis advised American politicians that, the Iraqis would be extremely grateful for the end of the Saddam Hussein regime, which in part was true, but that wasn't the whole story. And Bernard Lewis, in a letter, was actually contributory to a letter signed by other American politicians and academics, including Paul Wolfowitz and others, in 1998, that urged Bill Clinton to invade Iraq. So Bernard Lewis, despite his protestations that Orientalism is a field of study that rises above politics, brandished his credentials as an Orientalist to interfere in political, or rather to intervene in political debates. And Said, as an amateur critic, he tried to emphasize self-representation, namely by the so-called Oriental. But that would open the door to a diversity of voices and empowerment of human subjects. And Said also noted in his writings the continuity of colonialism in the present in the case of Palestine. And well, what was Said's position on the modern day example of colonialism in the form of the Israeli occupation of Palestine? Well, Said in his writings, he frequently tried to recognize, or rather, he argued that there was a dire need to recognize Jewish suffering. That yes, the Jewish people were victims of persecution and genocide, and that ultimately the resistance, or rather Palestinian project for liberation, ought to aim for equality in Palestine and Israel, and to achieve coexistence. And Edward Said co-founded the West Eastern Divan Orchestra with Daniel Barenbaum, an Argentine-Israeli composer. So we see that Edward Said did not negate the existence of Jewish suffering. This is something we need to bear in mind, that Said didn't, his critique of Israel did not deteriorate into an anti-Semitic narrative, or rather what some could call Occidentalism. Said was acutely aware that human history is actually made up of, the collective agency of individuals and communities, rather than essential identities of East and West, Jew and Arab. And but Said's critique of Israel was anchored or centered upon the disparity of power between Israel and the Palestinian people. And Said also recognized that Palestinians lacked an army, navy, an air force, and the institutions of the modern state. So this wasn't a symmetrical conflict between two equal combatants, far from it. Said argued that, well, we see the confinement of Gaza, of Gaza and the West Bank with no parallel in apartheid or colonialism. And Said, writing in 2001, noted that there were 140 settlements in the West Bank and Gaza at the time as well. And these settlements, made up of Jewish settlers, were characterized or complemented by checkpoints, and the olive and citrus trees of Palestinians were frequently uprooted, and the houses and homes of Palestinians were demolished, and the Israeli military expropriated land whenever it wished. And Said also noted that there is a deliberate effort to de-develop Palestinian society, to make the life of Palestinians impossible, to force them to leave, or to resort to desperate violence such as suicide bombing. There was actually a slide that I wanted to discuss. I think I jumped over it. Yes, Said's project of resistance at the epistemological level, that is, relied upon Giambattista Vico. Vico was a 18th century philosopher and the author of Scienze Nuove, the New Science, and he's invoked by Said in Orientalism and other writings. And Said cites Vico to say men make their own history, and then extend it to geography. And by invoking Vico, Said argues that neither Orient nor Occident are fixed, but are man-made, and they support and reflect each other. So Orient and Occident, East and West, mutually constitute each other. and that Orientalism is a kind of willed human work, and its critique requires a humanistic study of politics and culture. So to conclude my presentation, Edward Said was acutely aware that the struggle against colonialism or resistance was not merely political. It had to take place in the domain of epistemology, or rather the politics of knowledge. Colonialism in its classical forms and neo-colonial is based, or rather it is justified by a cultural hegemony that subordinates and makes the Oriental inferior. And that provides the very foundation for political intervention in the so-called East. I'd like to thank all of you for listening. And and if there are any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them.
Mohammed Hocam, this was wonderful for us. Thank you so much. It was a very inspiring presentation, which covered a lot about Said and Orientalism. We already had 3 questions. If you wish, I can give you these 3 questions at once, and you can give your answer as you wish, combining them. The first question was from Professor Aslı Ergül Jorgensen from Ege University. She had to leave because after asking her question because of her lecture. Sorry about that. She asked a question about Ottoman Orientalism. She said Ottomans was an object of Orientalism for Europe, but what do you think about Orientalism in the Ottoman Empire? I also interviewed an academic in Top University, Serdar Palabıyık, and he also told that there was a qualitative difference between Ottoman Orientalism towards Balkan and Middle Eastern nations that they saw as, less civilized brothers and sisters of Ottomans. But there was a qualitative difference between Ottoman Orientalists and European Western Orientalists. He said, what do you think? Do you agree? It would be wonderful to hear your opinions on this one. And the second question is about the current Western policies. Can we still identify Orientalist approaches in current Western policies? I guess we have to talk about the war on terror. There are a lot of materials about it. And I was also thinking of asking you a question about this French law on colonial past. In 2005, the French Assembly, as you know, passed a law saying that France had helped the colonized people to get much more civilized. So this in history classes at high school level in France. This also caused a lot of debates. So I would like to ask you a question about that one. I guess this is full of Orientalist Western policies. And the third question is about what Muslim countries can do in order to avoid this notorious perception of Western countries about the East. So maybe this can also be related to the question of reflexivity. Can the West become reflexive about its role in the current, maybe Daesh, for example, ISIS problem that they are alienating from the civilization? But this may also relate to the question of standards of civilization, which comes up on self-determination I'm studying. So in order to be eligible for self-determination, one has to comply with the standard of civilizations. But where does it come from? Who represents these standards of civilization? So I guess there are a lot of questions, winning questions for you. So it's up to you which ones to...
Okay, let me begin with the more historical questions. By Ottoman Orientalists, you're referring to Western scholars who studied Ottoman history, yes? Yes. Well, I'm not an expert in kind of the Ottomanist literature, but what I can say is that the Ottoman Empire was seen as the Mohammedan Empire, and it's interesting to see that rather than being an Islamic or Muslim empire, Orientalists up until the 20th century didn't refer to Muslims as Muslims. The self-designation that of their choice was ignored, but rather Mohammedans and Mohammedanism was used. But in the Western imagination, or rather European imagination, the Ottoman Sultan was seen as the Grand Turk, almost symbolizing the entirety of Dar al-Islam and Islamic civilization. I mean, I would say Turks were lumped together with Arabs and Iranis, and we see the term Saracens being used. There's a British rugby club called Saracens, and it's used to show that they are very strong and very brutal. So I would say perhaps for the last few hundred years in European imaginary, the Ottoman Empire exemplified the main threat to the West or the Occident, which has been replaced in the last century or so by Arabs and oil as a weapon, and in more recent years, Al-Qaeda and the war on terror. So I would say, I mean, at least from my amateurish knowledge of Ottoman historiography, there seems to be continuity that the Ottoman Empire was perceived as a threat to Europe, and especially with the two invasions of Vienna. So there was this horror that, well, the Muslims are literally at the gates in Central Europe. But then in the 18th century, we see the tide being reversed, and also which was followed by the era of modern Orientalism and the global empires of the French, the British, and even Russians, I would add. I mean, I hope I've been able to answer the first question. But with regard to the second question, current Western policies, it seems that Muslims are still regarded as a security risk, whether they are immigrants, well, I won't say immigrants, whether they are second or third generation immigrants in France, Britain, or Germany, and the whole the Muslims living in what we call the Muslim world. So there seems to be a continuity of sorts. Of course, there are transformation and changes in these stereotypes, but it seems that the civilizing mission has been reinvented, so to speak, in various ways, such as the relationship between the EU and Mediterranean countries. The fear of migrants crossing the Mediterranean has created panic among European citizens, which in part has been inculcated, or rather fostered, by the politicians. So there is this fear-mongering on the part of European politicians about migrants coming from across the Mediterranean, and that includes Africans, Arabs, Afghans, etc. And a more recent example of Western policies, yes, the 2003 invasion of Iraq. I think that was, I mean, the narrative was, well, we can bring democracy to Arabs, especially following the 9/11 attacks. So there was this argument that, well, the Arabs lack democracy because they're ruled by despots. Well, let's bring democratization through the barrel of the gun, so to speak. And you had so-called experts such as Fuad Agnew, Bernard Lewis, and actually Cold War policymakers such as Paul Wolfowitz and others who championed this invasion. So also at the same time, we see a reinvention of Cold War scholars as champions of the clash of civilizations. Yes. And the third question, what can Muslim countries do? Well, the picture is not all bad. I mean, I don't want to sound like a naysayer. Bernard Lewis, in the question of Palestine, notes that the European Union, as far back as the 1980, recognized the self-determination of the Palestinian people. So there is a recognition among certain European and Western policymakers that, well, not everything that happens in the so-called East is a source of problematic. But what can Muslim countries do? Well, Muslim countries are to a certain degree not guilty, but they have fallen into this narrative of this binary or hierarchy of Occident and Orient. And there's a certain degree of Occidentalism. But I must qualify this statement that it's not based upon the same power relations between East and West. So you have this self-victimization, which to a certain degree, the basis, I would argue, seems to be valid. There has been a very horrendous history of colonialism, whether it be ethnic cleansing of Algerians throughout the 19th century, and more recently in Palestine, in 1948, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were expelled from their homes, and this policy of ethnic cleansing still continues. But Said, in the question of Palestine, notes that, well, on the one hand, Arab and Muslim states champion the Palestinian cause, but on the other hand, they didn't support the champions of Palestinian liberation. Yasser Arafat was ignored and left to one side at a certain point. So what can Muslim countries do? There's a multi-pronged approach. Governments can try to foster more academic institutions that seek to critique Occidentalist and Orientalist notions of East and West. Whereas what can civil society do? Muslims and Arabs and others can set up organizations and associations and workshops to discuss and debate these issues. And I think universities are doing a wonderful job, such as yours, by hosting this East and West seminar series. I think there needs to be much more in this regard. And yes, so self-reflexivity on the part of academics in the Muslim world. And I think there needs to be a suspicion of totalitizing narratives, such as civilization and the modern state. I think they can be used, but what do you mean by civilization? And I think these concepts should not be used to bash the so-called Occident. So there has to be this self-critique from within that, well, Orientalism invented the Orient. Occidentalism should not reinforce the notion of an Occident. Yes. I hope I've answered your questions as best as I can.
Thank you so much, Mohammed Hocam. I think your emphasis on positionality is also very important here, because especially in Turkey, as we are based in Turkey, whose identity is a bit in between East and West, we can maybe say that we can also study as Turkish scholars Iran from an Orientalist perspective. So we should also be careful not to do that because we are not, this is about positionality. We may be Easterner, Oriental in London, but Occidental in Cairo, I don't know. And I was also, I meant to ask you a question about Turkish-Egyptian relations. What do you think about, you are an expert in Egypt and also you know Turkey very well. It would be wonderful to hear your opinions on that.
Well, it's a very interesting topic, a tad bit contentious. Well, I think Turkey and Egypt have an intertwined history. Well, I'm not selling a brochure to visit Egypt, but there's a long-standing relationship between the two countries, and even before the Ottoman Turks arrived in Egypt in the 16th century, and Turks have been in Egypt for the better part of 1,000 years. I would say the lines are blurred. I mean, if you were to go to Egypt, the lines are blurred between the Mamluk, Ottoman periods. It's very difficult to to make a watershed moment between these two periods. But to fast forward to the 21st century, I think Turkey and Egypt are interdependent to a large degree. I think in the last few years, when the diplomatic relations of these two countries were at best cold, the economic transactions still continued. So we need to bear in mind that yes, politics seems to envisage tensions and struggles at a particular level, but people-to-people relations is something entirely different. And I would say, to refer back to your question about positionality, I think in Egypt there's a similar narrative that, well, we are at the intersection between East and West. And we see this in the writings of Taha Hussein. For those of you who are not familiar with him, Taha Hussein was an Egyptian intellectual who studied at Al-Azhar University and became the Minister of Education and introduced universal education at university level. So Taha Hussein was not just an armchair academic. He really tried to implement a vision of Egypt as a modern society. And Taha Hussein argued in his book, The Future of Culture in Egypt, that, well, Egypt is not an Arab country. Actually, it's a Mediterranean, and that its face looks to Greek civilization and the West. So there are similar narratives in Egypt. I would dare even say Morocco and other countries, and even Tunisia, that, well, we are the space in which East and West meet and create a synthesis. So so I would say Egyptians and Turks can learn a lot from each other in their relation to the West and also in relation to each other. And I think you're absolutely right. Turks, as well as Egyptians and others, can study each other's culture through an Orientalist prism. And I would dare say they do. Unfortunately, there's the academic interaction between Turkey and Egypt occurs at the level of theology. So you have Muslim religious studies students going to Al-Azhar. But there isn't this academic interaction between Turkey and Egypt at the level of the social sciences, humanities, or even history, for that matter. So I would say greater people-to-people relations seems to be the case, but academic interactions seems to be more bilateral towards Europe and the West, unfortunately.
Thank you very much, Mohammed Hocam. I guess we have a question from a PhD student from Kadir Has University, Emre. If you can try, I know that your internet connection is not very stable, but we can try if you wish.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, we can.
Okay. First of all, thank you for your presentation. I would like to direct a question in your earlier talkings about the critics of Said. As you said earlier, from Aziz Ahmed or Neil Lazarus or Arif Dirlik accuses the post-colonial thought in not dealing with the economic capitalist development vis-a-vis the imperial or colonial encounters in the critics of Said, but do you see a reductionism in here? Because we can see a satisfactory explanation from the other post-colonial critics. For instance, Frantz Fanon, Gayatri Spivak, C.R.L. James, Eric Williams. These names are extremely dealing with the interlinkage or irresistible explanation between the slavery, for instance, and the capitalist development. So do you see a reduction? The whole literature to Said's text. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emre, for your excellent question. Yes, I mean, the Marxist critique, primarily launched by Ahmed and Dirlik, it's based upon, I would argue, the prejudice or bias that culture and ideology are merely epiphenomena. And that can perhaps, this can perhaps help us to understand the vehemence, or rather the enthusiasm on the part of Ahmed in unpacking and deconstructing Said's writings using an equally textualist approach. But yes, I mean, Said's writings, I don't think we can ever accuse it of being reductionist, far from it. Said's writings exhibit a sophistication that is enriched by his use of seemingly contradictory concepts such as hegemony, discourse, and even subjugated knowledges. And what Said does is, well, he tries to shift the focus of our focus from merely imperialism as a material phenomenon to that of the politics of knowledge. That, well, there are certain forms of knowledge that are acceptable and included and become orthodox, and other types of knowledge that are excluded and become heterodox, or rather ignored. And Said's contribution to colonial discourse analysis, this is something I should have mentioned, is enriched by his focus on a wide variety of genres that helps us to discern a narrative, or rather a discourse as a system of meanings. And I think in your question you alluded to this. Yes, Said's Orientalism cannot be seen in isolation from the contribution of Fanon, Spivak, C.L.R. James, and what Said does is he fills in the blanks. I think we shouldn't. I mean, we should have a more critical relationship with Said's scholarship, but bear in mind that ideas do matter without adopting an idealist interpretation of history. So what Said tried to show in Orientalism and his other writings is that, well, we shouldn't focus too much on material factors in and of themselves, nor at the same time we shouldn't be too preoccupied with the history of ideas. The history of ideas cannot explain hegemony, and this is why Said's incorporation of the Gramscian notion of hegemony is in part, is in large part Marxian, I would argue. Yes.
Thank you very much for your answer.
Thank you, Mohammed Hocam. There was also another question which was asked through Twitter. I think Edward Said was criticized for overlooking the resistance part and overemphasizing the representation part. Do you agree with criticism?
I would say it depends on which of his writings you read. Edward Said was a prolific author, and he engaged in representation and resistance, not just in books, but also newspaper columns in Arab world and throughout. No, Said was very much involved in the efforts of the PLO. Unfortunately, Said was faced by the reality that Arafat and his cohort were not amenable to advice. Said noted Arafat's view of Bill Clinton was the big white guy, the big white man. Said tried to introduce Iqbal Ahmed, a Pakistani intellectual who worked on American foreign policy and USA in general, into the PA. But Said's attempt to contribute to the resistance of the Palestinian struggle was met by resistance, ironically, by key figures of the PLO. No, I would say Said was firmly aware that representation was one side of the same coin as resistance, and the Israeli efforts to deny the Palestinians occurred at the level of not just politics or military power, but identity. Said was specifically interested in naming the Palestinian people. So there was a systematic effort by Israel to deny the very existence of Palestine. Well, what Palestine? And Said, in his writings, speaks about the Palestinian struggle, the Palestinian people, the Palestinian, would-be Palestinian state. So Said uses Palestine in the adjectival form to insist, well, we are here, and we do exist, and we won't be written out of history. So Said was particularly aware that, well, resistance is not merely military. It occurs at the level of epistemology, and this may seem quite strange to the ears of some, but if you understand his use of discourse, it allows us to see that, well, knowledge is capable of constructing reality, and that and Said, one could say, is a constructivist of sorts. And he seems to say, well, collective human agency, knowledge, ideas, and culture can indeed create reality, which I would say it's not very uncontroversial in this day and age. Yes.
I see what you mean, and your emphasis on epistemological resistance is key here, as far as I understand. So it's a resistance against epistemic violence, which excludes and ignores the presence of some peoples who are seen as inferior, or maybe from a cognitive bias, they don't see it, you know. Thank you so much. We have a question from a PhD student from İzmir Fatih Çelebi University, Ezgi.
Thank you, Didem Hocam. Firstly, thank you, Dr. Moussa, for this great presentation. My question is about women. I wonder where the women and gender issues are situated in Edward Said's literature works. And also, what do you think about Edward Said's self-Orientalism? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ezgi, for your interesting questions. Yes, on the question of gender and women, Said's critique of Orientalism tries to show that the Orient is seen as feminine, as the other, in relation to the Occidental masculinity. So, but at the same time, the image of the Orient changes. So the Orient is on the one hand feminine, then on the other hand fanatical, and then also depraved. So what Said tried to do is show the variety of stereotypes that Orientalists produced in relation to the Orient of their desire or choice. But for Said, yes, he would argue that the Orient is seen as something, as an object that is feminine in character, and that needs Western Western intervention on her part. Yes. So to answer the second part of your question, self-orientalizing. I mean, Said is often criticized by his detractors of contributing to an Occidentalist this narrative. I would argue that's not really the case. Said himself tried to get away from nativist narratives of identity. And this is why he argued against the possibility of even returning to a pre-colonial Islamic civilization. And similar to Fanon, once history has been passed, there's no going back. And I would say Said was very much aware that he was a product of the Enlightenment, and we see his incorporation of Giambattista Vico and a humanist interpretation of history. And also he draws upon Michel Foucault and Antonio Gramsci, and also there are some, and I would say perhaps there are assumptions that that history is made, well, at least in the case of Gramsci, history is made by subjects, and class is important. So Said tried to critique Occidentalist narratives of East and West. Yes.
Thank you so much, Mohammed Hocam. Evren Eken is my colleague from Isparta Süleyman Demirel University. Dr. Eken, the floor is yours.
And thanks, Didem. And this is a fascinating presentation. I'm delighted to be part of it, although I missed some of the basics in the beginning. Well, so thank you very much, Dr. Moussa and Didem Hocam. I have actually two questions. First of all, this is actually, I'm quoting another colleague of mine, an American colleague of mine, exactly. A few days ago in social media, he said that most of the theories, most of the social theories like Foucault and others are great, but mostly they have shitty politics, especially when it comes to Palestine. Although Edward Said was a prominent supporter of the Palestinian state and a vocal critic of Israel, why on earth, how on earth, most of the post-structuralist people, apart from Deleuze, I guess, are not that vocal or dismissing such a big issue? Secondly, I thought that initially I was going to upend the direction of the Orientalism by quoting Occidentalist stuff, but at the last minute of your last answer, you just mentioned Occidentalism. I have two questions regarding Occidentalism. First, what about the Occidentalism towards Ottoman Empire and Turkey through the Orient, if you can say it? And secondly, what about our feminization of the West from the same set of Occidental attitude? Because not only the West is trying to feminize or trying to look at the Orient through a feminizing from a gendering perspective, but also the Eastern people mostly try to feminize the West in the same manner. So it's just not the problem of Orientalism, I guess. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Evren Eken, for your interesting and thought-provoking questions. Yes, I mean to quote a quote. Yes, Foucault and other post-structuralist thinkers did indeed have shitty politics, and I guess this may have a lot to do with. I'm just proposing an explanation here, a tentative explanation. I mean, this may have a lot to do with the fact that their scholarship is largely restricted to the rise of disciplinary power within Europe and the West. Foucault's work on discipline and punishment and the history of sexuality tends to be drawn from the European archives in the broadest sense of the term, and Derrida, for that matter. I would say that there is a blind spot indeed with regard to the Middle East and the Arab world and more progressive forms of politics, and also I would say the post-structuralist emphasis can be read to be ultimately self-defeating. That, well, there's no real subject in history, and Foucault's work contributed to a certain degree to the end of. I mean, if Nietzsche signaled that God was dead, Foucault signaled, well, the author is dead. So I would say the potentially self-empowering effects of Foucault's and Derrida's scholarship meet at a dead end with regard to the possibility of a subject to emerge in history and to embark on progressive politics, whether it be against imperialism, sexism, Islamophobia, what have you. Yes, I mean, that would be a tentative explanation on my part. And actually, Said was really aware or fully aware that Foucault and other European intellectuals from whom he drew ideas, they had no time, they had no intellectual time for Arabs or Palestine. And this really made him quite disappointed that the likes of Foucault and others, well, they didn't see Palestine as a cause, as a justifiable cause to resist oppression. Yes, and I would say Said and other post-colonial intellectuals creatively adapted the writings of these post-structuralist intellectuals, and they expanded the critique from Europe to the Orient. And one work that really stands out is Timothy Mitchell's book, Colonizing Egypt. Mitchell argues, well, Jeremy Bentham's work on the Panopticon was indebted to a certain degree to his brother Samuel in the Ukraine and the Russian Empire. And Mitchell, he traces Foucault's scholarship back to colonialism, and I find this interesting that by pushing back, or rather problematizing the problematic offered by Foucault, post-colonial intellectuals have been able to go beyond, again to quote unquote, the shitty politics of Foucault and others. And what about Occidental narratives on the Ottoman Empire? I think you're referring to domestic narratives here in Turkey about the Ottoman Empire. Am I correct?
Regarding both domestic politics, both of the region's domestic politics.
Again, well, if we adopt a Saidian perspective, it seems to be a harking back to a, some would say, well, Turkey was never colonized. Okay, take that for granted, but it was victim to systematic policy of colonial powers. So I would say this harking back to a pristine Ottoman age could be an indication of Said's critique of, well, bypassing the present. and ignoring what has happened in the decades since the end of the Ottoman Empire, or even before, actually. So with regard to Occidentalist narratives on the Ottoman Empire and others, well, they can be problematized from the angle of, well, well, once change occurs, is it really possible to go back? And I think Fanon's writings can help us to better understand that the present goes forward as much as it goes back. And I think it is very difficult to excise, to excommunicate the colonial past or present. And it's ultimately self-defeating, because in the region we will experience a selective amnesia that will rob us of collective agency and also, I would argue, from the experiences of the present, not to repeat the same mistakes again. Yes, so what about the feminization of the West? Yes, I mean, there's a Sudanese writer called Tayyip Saleh, and in his novel Migration to the North, he speaks, well, he narrates the story of a Sudanese man who goes to Britain, and the relationship between the Orient and the Occident is yes, it's one between the masculine and the feminine. So the Occident is treated as feminine, and the Orient is treated as masculine. I would interpret this as a defensive psychological mechanism to reverse the relationship, to reverse the binary. But again, Said would argue that, well, this is just an example of nativism, and a nativism that obscures our contemporary reality. Yes. Again, I mean, to refer back to a comment I made earlier, yes, I mean, there seems to be a certain degree of the internalization of I won't say Occidental, but Orientalist stereotypes. But Said's work allows us to adopt a position of self-reflexivity to problematize these stereotypes. And I think this is key here, that we shouldn't go back to default stereotypes to explain politics and the economy, society, and our relations with other cultures. Yes.
Thank you so much, Mohammed Hocam. It's already 7:30. If you have time, we have a couple of questions. We can finish in 10 minutes if you wish. It's really up to you.
Okay, thank you. Yes, we can ask more questions, yes.
Thank you so much. Your student, Zülal Sema, has a question for you. Zülal?
Thank you, Dr. Moussa, for your presentation. I would like to ask a question about Said's idea about representation and resistance. According to his connection with PLO and also his argumentation about resistance, and he had an iconic picture that he was sending the rock through the Israeli people, so Israeli soldier, we can say that. So can we analyze his argumentation as we studied nonviolence in the field of nonviolence, how we can explain his representation and resistance argumentation, because somehow it's connected with the nonviolence.
Thank you, Zülal. Yes, Zülal took both my post-colonialism course and my nonviolence course. So to combine two courses into one, and yes, I think Said's project of resistance was very much geared upon taking the battle not just on the battlefield, or rather with physical force, but an intellectual one. And also, I would say, by inserting the Palestinian question into the politics of knowledge of North America and Western Europe. Said was a self-spoken professor of English literature. And for him, military aggression would only perpetuate the oppression of Palestinians. And he noted that so every time the Palestinians respond with violence, Israeli aggression is multiplied by manifold times. So Said was aware that military resistance had its limits, and that Israel is a modern state and which enjoys military supremacy, and importantly, the support of the USA. And the Palestinians without a modern state, without the very means to defend themselves, were embarking on a physical confrontation that would only lead to further violence on the part of Palestinians. So I won't say Said rejected violence as such, but Said tried to expand the discussion and to try to educate Palestinians to be aware of, well, this is how imperialism actually works at the level of orthodox knowledge, institutions of power. If we can speak about a military-industrial complex, we can speak about a political academic one. And I think Edward Said tried to shift the train of resistance from merely the West Bank and hurling a stone, which is an iconic image, but it doesn't quite capture Said's very complex and sophisticated understanding of imperialism in the 20th century or 21st century, for that matter. Yes. And his relationship with the PLO, again, so to mention again, he didn't have a good relationship with Yasser Arafat, insofar as Arafat was content with, initially, with being the head of the Palestinian Authority, but under Israeli tutelage. And Said observed that Yasser Arafat failed to actually understand how America functions or behaves. Yes.
Thank you so much, Mohammed Hocam. There is a question about the post-colonial states' political instability today. Are these caused by the colonial times policies? So political instability in post-colonial state, is it caused by the policies of colonial powers during the colonial period, in your opinion, and how important is it? This is a question posed by a PhD student from Çanakkale, 18 Mart University, Kartal Batuhan.
Thank you very much, Kartal. The instability of post-colonial states. I would say we shouldn't be reductionist and cast the blame on colonialism. Again, I would say there are certain continuities, but also disjunctures and transformations. I would say upon independence, there was a disproportionate emphasis on the coercive apparatuses of the colonial state. So if we expand the definition of the colonial state, one could say yes, all states are colonial to a certain degree. But if we narrow down our definition to argue that, well, a colonial state is one led by Western policymakers, bureaucrats, and soldiers, and well, its influence is long gone. And I would say, if we take the example of Egypt, yes, Egypt received independence in 1923. 1952, we see the Free Officers Movement. A group of young Egyptian officers overthrew the King of Egypt, and then subsequently a republic was established. We see that contemporary Egypt is actually more of a product of the 1950s and 60s than the 1930s and 40s or the decades preceding that. I mean, if we zone in on the deep state, the mukhabarat or the S.Baris state in the case of Egypt, this is very much a child of Nasserite Egypt. I mean, the Nasser regime in Egypt nationalized various sectors of society and of public life. These things would have been unimaginable in the colonial period. I'm not saying that there weren't attempts to do so, but post-colonial states had at their disposal a vast array of coercive and other powers that colonial states lacked. So I think it is important for us to identify continuities as well as transformations. Yes, and also the rise of one-party states in Africa and Asia and other parts of the world. They exercised a lot of power that could have enabled them, at least in theory, to roll back decolonization. And we see this in Libya under Muammar Gaddafi. Gaddafi introduced a policy of Arabization, and he brought doctors, academics from around the Arab world to phase out the colonial era educational and other institutions. But again, I mean, the instability of post-colonial states cannot be solely laid at the door of colonialism. The one-party states that inherited these colonial states, they should be blamed too, if blame is the right word.
Thank you so much, Mohammed Hocam. The last question from Ayşe Dilara Akmeşe, a master's student from Manisa Celal Bayar University.
Thank you, Didem Hocam. Firstly, thanks for your great presentation. As you know, even the terminological definition of the Middle East is an Orientalist and Eurocentric definition. And throughout history, there are different maps that have been popularly used by centering different regions. And accordingly, there are different regions. There are different centers as a region. Do you think it is possible to develop an alternative mapping and decentralized discourse style without centering a particular region as the most important? I'm wondering your opinion about this.
Thank you very much, Aisha. Another excellent question. Yes, by deploying labels such as the Middle East, Near East, Orient, these continue the Orientalist binary between East and West. And again, it depends upon the positionality of the speaker and the writer. So if I can reminisce or go down the path of nostalgia, when I was doing my postdoc in Japan, the Middle East, or rather what we call the Middle East, was referred to as West Asia. However, even by adopting such a terminology, it still occurred within the academic space of area studies. So area studies as a field of specialty, yes, it comes from, it emerged from the relationship between academics and policymakers. So by imagining parts of the world into blocks or regions, this made them more amenable for policy intervention and policy making, which is, one would say, yes, to be expected or inevitable. However, I mean, for us in this part of the world, yes, we need to question, well, can we still refer to Egypt, Libya, or rather Syria, Lebanon as the Middle East, especially when you're just due south, in other words. I mean, you could draw a line south from Turkey to Syria. So by deploying these labels as West Asia or Middle East, we need to, that actually still restricts us within the framework of area studies. And area studies is, as I mentioned, as a field of study, it's related directly to power, questions of power, governmentality, and also policymakers. Again, the question I would ask, not just to you, but to those listening today, is a form of knowledge possible that addresses people, or rather the grassroots possible, rather than merely satisfying policymakers and regimes? Because when we speak about, well, we need an alternative discourse, well, this alternative discourse can be constituted and co-opted by regimes and governments. And this is what Edo Said tried to critique in Orientalism and his other works. Well, there's too close an affinity between policymakers, intellectuals, and academics. Again, how can forms of knowledge be produced that actually empower social groups and ordinary people? And I think this is the implication of Edward Said's scholarship, that, well, knowledge serves the powers that be. Yes. I hope I've answered the question, Aisha. Yes.
Mohammed Hocam, thank you so much. These were very big questions, which are very inspiring. And if you allow me, I would like to ask one last question before before you leave.
Moderator's prerogative, yes.
Thank you so much. I'm using my position. I'm aware of that. As I see you, I meet you, I'm really happy to be able to ask this question, which is really intriguing me, because I'm studying post-Western IR. These debates, whether a global IR is possible, led by Amitav Acharya. And he's saying not trying to replicate post-colonialist thinking, because he thinks that post-colonialism, as far as I understand, is trying to leave the West behind, while agency to the East. And he's saying he wants an inclusive global IR theory, which doesn't alienate the West. And I keep thinking about what you said during your presentation. You said that in order to decolonize, you cannot go back. You have to move forward. So I was really wondering about this idea of moving forward. What does it mean? You cannot unthink what you already experienced as subordination, but you have to rethink your position towards the maybe oppressor or previous oppressor. That's what I understand, but I would love to hear if you elaborate on that a little bit. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you very much for the final clinching question. Yes, I'm vaguely familiar with the post-Western IR literature and also the contribution of Barry Buzan, among others. Yes, so if I may quote myself, I think that the works of Fanon and Said, they observe that once human beings embark on a certain process or path, I mean, the very difficulty of returning back has a lot to do with the psychological baggage that we carry with us. And I think it is very, I mean, it is, we can pretend, or rather we can delude ourselves that, well, this didn't happen, or rather the chain of events of violence and systematic oppression didn't happen. But this selective amnesia robs us from the wealth of experience that we can draw upon to propose alternatives. And And I would say post-colonialism, I want to problematize this ism. It's not a coherent body of literature or scholarship. Actually, you could speak about contradictory and conflicting fields that fall under the umbrella or rubric of post-colonial thinking. And actually, post-colonial theorists, far from trying to forget the West, they try to include the West, and they put forward syncretic interpretations of identities, societies, and cultures. But the issue is that I would say the main critique of post-colonialism is that it neglects the question of power, or rather political power, and focuses too much on hybridity, cultural identities. And yes, I mean, to a certain degree, post-colonialism seems to be more at home in comparative literature departments and cultural studies than political science and international relations. And I would say this is where I've tried to, I mean, in my own work and teaching, I've tried to kind of break this mold. And by introducing a more broadly conceived post-colonial perspective to understand ideas, politics, and even nonviolence. I would say that the impact of the colonial past, and some would say the present, is undeniable. And decolonization cannot erase the past. But what it can do is create, or rather foster, intellectual, psychological, and even epistemic mechanisms to deal with a negative, or rather a past of alienation. And yes, a globally inclusive IR. Well, again, I mean, post-colonial theory or post-colonialism can contribute to that, especially with regard to the hybrid identities. Yes, I mean, I can go on, but I think our audience have had enough, and I don't blame them.
No, we can listen to you until the morning, until the night. Thank you so much. But I think we can invite you again if you have time later for another round, because I'm sure there are so many questions left for you on post-colonialist thinking. It's been a wonderful experience for us to have you with us today. Thank you so much, Mohammed Hocam. And there are so many students and colleagues from different parts of Turkey which came here to meet you and listen to you. Your students are so lucky to have you, I should say. Post-colonialism taught at many universities, unfortunately, but we really need to think in post-colonial terms while teaching IR. So we really need what you do. Thank you so much, and hope to see
thank you, Didem. Thank you, Didem Hocam. Yes, I would like to thank you and the participants and all the students who have participated. I think we've had a lively and stimulating discussion, and it's actually made me ponder much further on these questions. And yes, thank you again to you and the university for the kind invitation.
Thank you so much. After the COVID pandemic, we are really waiting for you to come also to Izmir. You are most welcome. Thank you so much again, and thank you to all participants for their wonderful questions. And hope to see you again. Hope to see you soon. And take care.
Thank you very much. Memnun oldum. Thank you.
Çok teşekkürler.
Okay. İyi akşamlar.
İyi akşamlar. Çok teşekkürler arkadaşlar. Görüşmek üzere. Ahmet,
teşekkür ederiz hocam.
Bu arada kaydı artık durdurabilirim. Ahmet Hocam, eğer kalırsanız yapabiliriz. Konferansla ilgili. Kaydı sanırım şöyle durduruyorum.